Luca burst through the door, barreling toward the room in the abandoned and isolated house. They managed to renovate it since Leo and Danny lived there. The interior greatly differed from the outside of the house, which screamed unlivable. "Where is it?" Luca started to ask as soon as he entered the room, but froze at the two unexpected captives tied to chairs. They were women. One sported a short brown pixie cut, her sharp brown eyes fixated on him with an impassive expression. Although dressed in black clothes, Luca could tell she was muscular. If he could properly recall, he'd say her build was about the same as the opponent he fought a week prior. He turned his expression to the other woman and froze. There she was, just as he remembered her. The woman who successfully stole the heirloom back from him and nearly made his life a living hell. Something about the repulsed expression on her face made his blood simmer. All he had to do was raise an eyebrow in Danny and Leo's direction for Danny to explain. "I tracked them. They were camping out in an abandoned warehouse, alone. We caught them sneaking out and brought them here." When dealing with captives, Luca, Danny, and Leo decided to never use their names. If need be, Danny and Leo called each other partner and Luca boss. That's the way it went. "Do you have it?" Luca asked without taking his attention off the captives. Leo stepped forward and handed him the ring. Luca lifted it to the light, looking for the markings of the original ring of the daughter of Spain. Everything was there. He handed the ring to Danny and said, "Make sure this gets straight to him." By him, they all knew he was referring to his dad. Luca could have blown out a breath of relief, but instead sent a faint prayer of thanks to God by default, even though he knew God wasn't pleased. "So," he cracked his knuckles, narrowing his eyes on his captives, "I have questions." He was rewarded with a chunk of spit landing at his feet and a fiery glare from hazel eyes, making his lips pull into a delighted sneer. He stepped over the offering, standing directly above the woman, giving her no choice but to stare up into his eyes. She didn't falter in the slightest. Luca snapped, beckoning Leo to come closer. He jerked his head toward the other woman. "Take her to the other room." When Leo reached for the woman, an animalistic growl rose from deep within her throat, and her expression hardened into something deadly. Leo paused. To Luca's surprise, Leo released a low growl of his own that made the room go eerily silent. His lips pulled back as he bared his teeth at her, stunning her into silence. When he removed her from the chair, bringing her to the exit, she didn't fight him. The door slammed behind them, leaving Luca alone with the woman he thought he'd never see again. But here she was, completely at his mercy. The realization brought him some satisfaction. "I'm a little upset I wasn't the one to capture you," he said while stepping away from her. When all she did was keep a steady glare on him as if her eyes were lasers, he continued, "I'm almost tempted to get revenge, but I'll settle for answers. Who are you?" Silence. "Who do you work for?" Silence. Luca scoffed before muttering to himself, "I guess it is to be done the hard way." He grabbed the chair that was occupied mere moments prior, facing it so that his chest hit the back of the chair. He stared deep into the woman's eyes, attempting to look past the fury deeply embedded there. He came back unsuccessful. "I get why you're angry. I'd be upset too if I were such an incompetent, lousy thief like yourself." Satisfaction blossomed in his chest when her eye twitched. He kept going. "I mean, imagine having the heirloom in your possession and it being stolen so easily." He inwardly grimaced as his words applied to him too. "You're not even a worthy opponent, shabby at most. Your friend over there put up a better fight than you. Now you're tied up in my domain with no escape, so I'd start talking if I were you. I'm not the most patient man." He punched his next words out. "Who do you work for?" Even then, silence was all he received, but the change in her expression showed he hit a nerve. He stood from his chair and went to a cabinet near the door. "If you won't talk, maybe your partner will, and if she thinks of playing dumb..." He retrieved a pair of pliers, allowing her to see them. Her eyes widened the smallest fraction. "We'll just have to play a little game of dentist." Luca used this method many times to intimidate his captives. The pliers remained unused on people, but the frightened reactions he received were more than enough to get the answers he needed. He worried he'd actually have to use them today. "I don't work for anybody," she finally said with a hoarse voice. Luca raised a disbelieving eyebrow and went to open the door, but she raised her voice almost frantically. I swear, we don't." Luca paused, crossing his arms over his broad chest. He fixed her with a quizzical stare. "Then why are you a thief? Looking for some easy money?" She looked offended before schooling her expression. She tilted her head at him, her jaw clenching. "We're righting the wrongs people like you dirty Italians cause." He stormed over to her, having enough sense to keep a good enough distance to avoid the nasty headbutt she evidently itched to give him. His voice lowered and his tone darkened. "You speak as if I don't have the upper hand in this situation." That made her falter, but he didn't seem to notice as he added, "I'd keep a close watch on what you say from here on out. I don't favor sharp tongues." He straightened when she kept quiet. He headed for the door, pausing when she asked, "What are you going to do to her?" He spared her a glance over his shoulder, not caring to assure her after her rather offensive and incorrect insult. He purposely slammed the door behind him, hearing it rattle on its hinges. He approached the second room to see the door closed, and Leo standing in front of it with his usual stony expression, although he seemed distracted. Luca nodded at the door, drawing his attention. "Let me in." At Leo's directed gaze on the pliers Luca forgot to put away, he sighed. "I didn't use them." To further assure him, he gave it to him. Leo opened the door for him and closed it shortly after. Luca faced the expressionless woman, praying she'd be more willing to give information than her insufferable partner. "I'm growing impatient of talking with your friend next door. If you won't answer my questions, don't waste my time further." To his surprise, she straightened, appearing calm and overly collected for someone who was kidnapped and being held captive. "Depends on what you want to know." Luca figured he imagined it, but he heard a faint accent in her silky voice. Now that he recalled, both women did, but he couldn't put his finger on what kind it was. He kept his expression placid. "I want to know who you are and why you were after the heirloom of the daughter of Spain." She sat forward a fraction, her eyes locked on his. "Let's just say it didn't belong to who had it. We planned to return it to the original owner." From the look on her face, he couldn't gauge if she was lying or not, but she was a lot more compliant. "So you returned stolen items?" he inquired. "Exactly." She sat back comfortably, as if they had come to some grand agreement. But his curiosity wasn't satisfied. "You never answered my first question. Who are you?" "That I cannot answer." "And why not?" She raised an eyebrow at him, her lips pulling into a small frown. "I answered your most important question, and you're wondering what my name is." Luca bit the inside of his cheek, turning away from her for a moment. What was with these women and their secrecy of names? He knew the answer since he didn't reveal his name to enemies either, but still he was growing restless. From the corner of his eye, he saw her move her wrist and quickly faced her. She stilled, appearing innocent, but he knew she was almost out of her roped prison, if not already out of them, and was waiting for the chance to escape. He diverted her attention. "I don't believe I was granted your acquaintance the night of your heist, was I?" He successfully distracted her, taking the opportunity to scan her face. He nodded at her jaw. "Although that looks pretty fresh. When'd you get it?" The faint purple mark on her jaw gave away that she was, in fact, thief number one from that night. He waited to see if she'd acknowledge his claim. "I may or may not have had a run-in with a thief myself a week ago, but it seems he got a beating of his own." The mocking grin that split her face at the sight of his darker bruise made him clench his jaw and fists. I always did admire my partner's ability to immobilize even the biggest of opponents. Pride oozed from her tone, and her smile grew wider when he failed to mask his irritation. She was almost as horrid as the other woman. Almost. Growing exhausted from talking with his unexpected guests, he strode to the door, opened it, and peeked his head out. Leo was a further distance away from the door, as if he didn't want to be near. Luca disregarded that and said, "Our captive has loosened her ropes. I need you to redo them." Leo's gray eyes shot to his, and a flash of reluctance masked his expression before it was back to unreadable. Why me? But he knew why. Leo tied ropes the best with his complicated knots. That's why Luca was surprised someone escaped them. It was also how he knew Danny had tied him up that day. It was too easy to escape.
Leo walked past him, grumbling something along the lines of ropes being outdated and how handcuffs are easier. But again, Luca ignored him. Luca watched Leo duck to enter the room, and the way thief number one's attention was immediately drawn to his intimidating person. She watched his every move as he stalked toward her, crouching down to check the ropes secured around her wrists.
As Luca expected, they were loose. Too loose, and it made him wonder how long she'd been pretending to be bound for. Leo expertly tied the ropes, tugging on them as a warning not to try that again. Thief number one winced, grabbing Leo's attention. He looked up at her, catching her eye in an intense gaze. They didn't break it for a few long moments, and Luca was starting to feel uncomfortable. Before he could clear his throat to break them out of the trance they seemed to be in, thief number one leaned closer to him, saying something Luca couldn't hear. Leo suddenly turned to him with an overly irritated expression. His eyes darkened and his brows lowered as he said in a low voice, "She has to use the bathroom." Now, Leo's reaction was justified, but Luca wanted no part in that. "Then take her. You know where the bathroom is." If looks could kill, Luca would have been 6 feet under by yesterday. Leo released a deep breath, muttering something in their birth language before grabbing thief number one's arm and leading her out the door. As he did, Luca heard him threaten, "If you take too long, I won't hesitate to knock the door down." Thief number one said something in a larkish tone, but they were too far away for him to hear. He didn't wait to see if Leo would make good on his promise, instead going to check on the she-devil in the opposite room. He mentally prepared himself for whatever she'd say, or do, but faltered when the chair she was tied to was empty. The ropes tied to her wrists now discarded on the concrete floor. The window on the opposite side was wide open, ushering in a breeze. Luca rushed toward the window with a curse, peering out of it for any signs of the woman's escape. By now, she could be long gone. Luca stepped away from the window with a long groan, running a hand through his curly black hair. He allowed his head to tilt back for a millisecond before closing the window. He went to tell Leo of the captive that escaped when he felt a presence at his back. He had no time to react before something jumped on him, a vice grip being placed around his neck. He recognized the form of a person, concluding he had been tricked into believing she escaped, but he had to get out of her surprisingly strong hold quickly. He tried to pry her small arms away from his neck to allow some airflow, but she didn't budge. The longer he attempted, the more useless he was rendered. So he held her arms in place and ran backward until he hit one of the hard walls. He felt her breath leave her in one swift movement, taking advantage of her weakened state to flip her over his back and onto the cold, hard floor beneath them. He managed to catch his breath for a moment and moved to pin her to the ground, much like he had the first night they met. She fought against him like a wild animal, thrashing and clawing aimlessly, but he managed to dodge her fists and pin her wrists to the ground again. "Stay still," he grunted as his grip was beginning to loosen on her. She did the exact opposite. His grip slipped, and she grabbed his forearms, pulling his face down straight into her awaiting head. He was forced back by the strength of her headbutt, and a spurt of blood left his nose. He landed on his back as she pushed him, sending blow after blow to his face. He managed to block a few, but a lot more landed, leaving his vision starry. He still fought to get her off of him, but the deadly force behind each hit had him unable to think clearly. In the blink of an eye, the pressure of her body was lifted from his torso, and the sound of her frustrated grunts sounded off from somewhere else in the room. Luca peeled open his eyes to see Leo holding her in a tight grip, pinning her arms to her sides with one large arm. Beside him, thief number 1 quietly watched the whole thing unfold, making no move to help her partner or run away. He set eyes on his attacker, his vision turning red with untamable anger. He approached her writhing figure, barely processing the way her eyes slightly widened as he firmly gripped the front of her shirt. He yanked her from Leo's hold, bringing her so close that their noses nearly touched. He let her see the dark threat in his eyes. "You're going to regret that." He looked past her momentarily to bark an order at Leo. "Take her back to the room and make sure she doesn't escape." Leo hesitated, spiking Luca's anger even more. His voice grew louder. "Now!" Leo and thief number 1 left the room, leaving them alone. He didn't speak as rage pulsed in his veins, begging him to hit something, anything, but he momentarily pushed it away. He took hold of her arms with a bone-breaking grip, hearing her cry out. He retrieved the rope she discarded, but instead of tying her up to the chair again, he wrapped it around her wrists as tightly as he could. The sound of her pain only angered him more. He spotted the metal hook hanging from the ceiling, a hook previously used for an old punching bag, and looped the rope through it. He pulled until she was forced to stand on her tiptoes and secured it. Once, twice, 3 times. He watched her face pull into a grimace at the uncomfortable position she was in and grabbed her chin, forcing her eyes to his. The numbness in her hazel irises was almost enough to douse the fire inside his chest and replace it with curiosity about what she had to endure to have no feeling inside of her, as if her soul had left behind an empty vessel to roam the earth. He clenched his teeth to rid himself of the thought and pretended to relish the unnerving sight before him. He leaned close and said, "Be lucky I don't do worse." He released her harshly and stormed to the door. He paused to spit blood on the floor and left the room with no coherent thoughts. His body trembled with rage, and he reveled in it, if only to drown out the punch of conviction inside of him. But he knew what he signed up for, and there was no going back, no changing the awful things he'd done. He knew heaven was too far away for him, and if God was close, he wanted nothing to do with the callous man he was, especially after what he'd just done out of wrath. With that, he climbed the stairs and went to the one room designated for moments like this. The room wasn't fixed up like the others were, instead sporting several fist-shaped holes in pale white drywall with dust littering the bare floor. Luca found a spot and punched with all his might, releasing a fraction of his anger. He continued until his entire being felt numb and his energy ran out. One thought plagued him more than any others, shredding any part of him that was once slightly intact. He was just like Enzo Romano, if not worse. Enzo let his anger get the best of him more often than not. Delighted in the power it gave him, it turned him into a monster, a beast near untamable by any man, and Luca wasn't too far off. Luca let his thoughts drift away, momentarily forgetting about Enzo Romano and his sickening drive to have unfathomable power, forgetting about his inadequacies, forgetting about his question of where the heck Danny had been for so long, forgetting about the captives, the infuriating woman he all but wanted to throttle, forgetting that he'd never be able to escape the life he was born into, not even in death.